is, how is ESG, Jack, different than a momentum play in Tesla now, or Next Era now, or Orsted now? Those stocks are making us wealthy not because of ESG, but because they're well governed and they have technological momentum. So I'm a little suspicious of this ESG stuff, even though I wrote a book about it called New World Companies. If I look at how I've invested for 40 years versus this trend of ESG, I think we have a little bit of a romance with ESG. Turning it back to you, Jack.
Bruce, you are so behind the times. It's just, it's all coming clear to me now.
Okay. I take that as rude and inaccurate, Jack.
But however you want to phrase it, you ask the question.
It's rude. It's rude.
Okay.
You're looking down your nose.
No, I'm not.
Two-thirds of the money doesn't think like you.
Not yet. Remember when I started, not even 1% thought like me. Guess where we are
today? So you believe that in the next 77 years, everyone will think like you? It's a war between speculative capitalism.
Bruce, thank you.
Jack.
Bruce, I believe that ESG, let me go back to this point I made early on, will be fully integrated in a company culture. What Scott and Train is doing, and the reason I wanted to, we're so fortunate he's on the call, what they are doing, if other companies don't do this in their own way, they're going to fall way behind, and frankly, they'll become a stranded asset, in my opinion. So whether you start with a technical approach, which you're talking, and by the way, Tesla has huge governance issues.
I agree. I agree. That's why they get only a little bit of my money.
All right. Well, no, but now I'm talking about the big institutions. What are they going to be doing? And they are going to be looking for the next train in various industries. So ESG is one way to enter the review or the screening process. But as you've learned today, one of the things you've learned today, and there are many to learn from other people on this call.
I agree.
Yeah, is that there are, I don't know how many services there are today that are doing ESG, providing a service of ranking. But there are many, and you can subscribe to an outside service. And if you tapped into, say, MSCI today, which is one of the bigger ones, and you tap Train into it, you would never learn about Train what you've learned in the last 45 minutes from Scott too, and how the company thinks and what's really going on. Because that's what's the differential is. And that's why I feel there's a huge future for fundamental research and understanding cultures and how people think, and boards and C-suites, et cetera. So to your question, Bruce, there are many ways to get to the top of the mountain, and ESG has been one for me, and it's expanding. And I think it's going to be integrated. And the big differentiator going forward is climate, in my opinion. So what companies, how they view it, what they're doing. You've heard from Scott about what they're doing at Train. But for companies that are not, who are poo-pooing climate, I think their game is over. Ultimately, they're going to go out of business. So, and you can quote me on that if you want, Bruce. So one of the things we were about to lead into was when we have people on public boards here. As we talked yesterday, and I'll just summarize a point I wanted to make. I think one of the suggestions and recommendations I have for others in the finance industry, and frankly anybody interested in sustainability, is the need and the opportunity to get involved on boards. And where do you start if you're a young person in your 30s, say, or 20s, and you want to get going down this path? Well, I think you start, the easiest path to get started on is in nonprofits, something that you believe in, preferably an environmental nonprofit. And from there, you can go into the private nonprofits fairly easily. Where it becomes tricky is how you go from private to public, because public companies don't really want to talk to people who haven't had public company experience. And we now have several people here today that I want to ask about that, including Sandra. What are your suggestions for folks if they want to get more actively involved? Because I've been saying, I've thought for years, and I will firmly believe that a big part of the solution lies in the corporate boardroom. What is your suggestion for individuals how to get on public boards, and what's the path? And Pam, I'd like you to talk about that as well, and anybody else on the call who's on public boards. Sandy?
That's a big question, Jack.
That's why I gave it to you.
Well, and I must be honest with you, the path from nonprofits into corporate boardrooms, it's tiny. It's almost non-existent. You'd have to be like, I don't know, maybe the CEO of Susan G. Komen or something like that to be considered because of the depth and breadth of experience that we're looking for on board. So I don't want to be Pollyannish and fool people and think that nonprofits have been a good way to get on boards. I think the governance experience, especially if it's a national nonprofit, is good. But we're really still drawing on a lot of different experiences, and most of them are business related. With that said, we talk about this a lot because still so much of how you get on a board is the networks. And I am a big believer in people getting to know executive search people throughout their careers, because executive search people, and it's in our proxy statements now, how we actually go about searching for new directors. And more, at least the companies I'm involved with, we're utilizing executive search people. We spend a lot of time on the spec itself in terms of the skills that we're looking for. And obviously, you know that diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity in particular, is really big right now, as it should be. And so we're really expanding diverse members onto the boards. So I am encouraging, especially young women I know who don't always pick up the phone when a recruiter calls, to establish those relationships during your careers, because then when you have enough business experience to be considered for a board, you get relationships that you need from an executive recruiter point of view. So again, while I don't discount the nonprofit experience, I think it's still a long putt.
Fair enough. But I also said private companies as well. So and from the thought
I heard you say private nonprofits.
Sorry. I meant private and nonprofits. Okay. Thank you, because you've been very successful at it. And Pam, do you have any thoughts on that? Because boards today, at least the ones I've been involved with and talked to, are starved to have minorities who are competent on their groups. And so what advice do you have for women, young women, because you've been actively promoting this in the Boston community and through the National Association of Corporate Directors? Let's say Nam Kapoor wanted to go on a public board. What advice, Pam, would you give to her?
Well, I think it's always how you position yourself and what you think your skills are, because like Sandy said, is that boards are really recruiting for specific skill sets. They have a matrix, and they're seeing, what are the skills that they already have on their board, who's going to be rotating off, what are we going to be missing, what are the gaps. It helps a lot if you are diverse, and being just a white woman is not diverse anymore. So it helps a little, but not a lot. It helps if you have additional diversity. And the other thing is that the easiest way to get on any board is from an audit committee, because there are 3 independent board members that have to be on the audit committee. And you don't have to be a CPA. I'm not a CPA, but I've been on the audit committee for 7 public companies. So you need to be familiar with numbers, and that can be even just in your regular business experience. And just the last thing I'd say is that I've never gotten on a board because of a recruiter, because I'm a former banker and they hate us. We're not in that sort of round peg, round hole. And so 70% of board seats are filled through your own networks. So think about your own networks and who are the people who are on boards. And if any of you are interested, I'm happy to help you with a board bio. I spend a lot of my time doing that on a pro bono basis. So Jack has my email, but it's plenahan@rachelconsulting.com. And you can just Google me and you'll find me.
Good advice. Now, there are others here who are on public boards or who have been on public boards. Would you like to pitch in? Mark, do you have anything to say on this subject? Mark Collins?
Jack, I'm not on public boards, but private boards, and that's a very different situation. So I do agree, just in terms of the personal networks that we all have, constantly expanding that, and seeking opportunities to bring as much value as we can to private companies where I'm particularly active. But of course, impact is greater on the public side.
Thanks. And Mike, you got something to add to this? I know you do. Mike Eckert.
I would say the dominant theme of selecting new board members is trust. Does the CEO and the existing board, do they feel confident they can trust this new person? And a lot of that is not based on skill, it's based on experience. Have they been a CEO? Do they know what that means? Have they been on another board? Have they been on that board? Have they been on another public board to deal with SEC requirements and compliance and so on? You know, like, do they know what they're doing here? And on-the-job training is not recommended. And so it's a matter of building instantaneous trust that, yeah, we want this person on the board. On the board, the public board that I'm on, we just recruited 2 new board members last month. It's been disclosed. One was a very senior African-American, and one was a very well-respected woman in the financial sector, both of whom we could totally trust immediately based on their experience. So just think about trust rather than skills. And how does, if a person wants to get on a public board, think about conveying trust. That would be my recommendation.
That's a good one. You didn't say which public board you're on, but I'll say it is on the Hannon Armstrong public board. I don't know, Scott, you might be interested in that tidbit of information. But Hannon, again, to me, is a company that is a poster child for climate. And they just put out their annual report a couple of days ago. It's online. The company is all about climate solutions, right up front about it. And they, for every new project they look at, one of the things they look at is how much will this project reduce the carbon footprint and water usage. And if it doesn't do one or both of those, they won't finance a project. That's quite something. And they started small and they're getting bigger and bigger. And they're not just doing the $10 and $20 million deals anymore. Now they're doing hundreds and above. So there's a real story there, but we don't need to get into that yet.
Oh.
Matt Patsky, can you have anything to say about boards and getting on public boards and the importance of it, please?
I mean, I think it's been addressed, but there is obviously clearly pressure on all boards to add more diversity, more women, and more people of color to their boards. And so, particularly, if you were a woman of color with financial services experience, there is tremendous opportunity, I think, for you on corporate boards, and I would certainly have your resume with Pam and Mike, and because there's just I think we're on the other side as shareholders, pressing companies on the significance of making sure there's diversity in the board, diversity in the C-suite, and that they have obviously robust programs on addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion across their organization, and I think there's that's creating a lot of opportunity for I just say a lot of opportunity for there to be expansions in the diversity of boards.
Claudine, you're raising your hand. You gotta go.
I would like to, I just add, I served on a private board, Mohawk Fine Papers, and I concur with what Mike Eckert said about trust. But the other reason, because I often ask, why did you choose me? They said, because of your knowledge and, being a leader at that time on climate, but also my strategic sense. And there was a question earlier about mid-sized companies. What's the first step? How do you begin? Well, what I advised Mohawk Fine Papers is that you do the least cost first, that you have certain criteria to review the plethora of options that are necessary in reducing one's greenhouse gases. And as a paper company, they had to look at their timber resources, they needed to look at their water use, a whole broad spectrum of things. But having specific criteria as a skill, the ability to look at least cost, I think, was very important to them, and probably to other boards too, because now the big political message is, well, we don't want to do anything on climate because it'll kill the economy. Well, we have to dampen that whole argument on the part of the Republican senators today, because otherwise we're not going to get a significant movement on climate. And as you say, Jack, this is an urgent situation. So, but for private companies, I think, trust, knowledge, and also skills, but looking at least cost solutions is critically valuable.
I just want to jump in and reiterate the fact that we're dealing with different levels of scale, complexity. Everyone has certain values and cultural beliefs, yet within that are key core interests that are not necessarily the same. Particularly in Congress, there's a lot of confusion between values and cultural norms and interests. And if we really drill down, I think we find out that a lot of we share in common. But we don't get there because it gets lost in the argumental noise. And when we look at the economy, when we look at this, the equity in this conversation today, and the bridge between economy and the environment, I mean, that's the 30,000 foot, conclusion that we need to drill down, as Claudine says, how she devoted her life and bridging these worlds. And I can't, honor Claudine more than phenomenally important work to consider, all of us to consider. You bet.
Useful. One of the things we agreed we'd do yesterday, Bruce, is that we send out a list to everybody who's participating of who their attendees and how to contact them. And I think that would be really useful to people who are on the call. So I just want to make an observation from this brief discussion. And this, I'm targeting Nam and Catherine and Liz and Scott too. I think all four of you should be on public boards, and there are people in this group today that can help you get from there to here. Seriously, you've all got the capacity, and you can have a major impact, and that is something I'd like to see each of you do.
I'd like to build from what Mark Ecker got me thinking about regarding boards. So if I think back of the board experiences I've had, and I think Michael hit the nail on the head, is that it's about trust and experience. And in the boards that I've been on, or the boards that I've served as a management consultant, such as Agrium, there is a blindness or myopia within the board where the CEO likes to appoint the type of person and the type of thinker in general that they're like, right? So that if they happen to be deal makers, I found the CEOs that are on the board of directors are deal makers. If they happen to want people who are people of great caution, but who know they on the boards, that what's valuable to me about a board selection is a lot of the boards that I've served on really want access to larger customers. They may already be approaching $1 billion, but they want to have access to a Walmart at 600 billion, right? Where they might want to have access. So access besides trust. They also want an equity share, right? So if I think about the startups that I've been on the board of directors, they want to give me part of the equity, but what they want is my knowledge on having created a corporation. So trust, Michael, I think is one thing, and experience is another. And I think that since you have talked about strategic sense. But Michael Eckert, I know you're writing a book. I think you got to tell us more about what boards of directors need. So, I think it's very interesting. For the last year, I've dealt with 32 board members for 90 minutes every 2 weeks. Some of them from South Africa, some of them the chair of Shell, like Chad Holliday was part of this mix. And what's interesting, Michael, is board selection, like was said, is a very secret matrix, a set of criteria. Is the person ex-CEO? Is the person black? Is the person a woman? Is the person a scientist? Is the person a deal maker? It's very complicated matrix, right? So, Michael, you probably have a lot more to say from your city experience and from your board experience, and having created ACOR. We need, I think, a little bit more nuance at this point. A newcomer says, "How the hell do I become trustworthy?" Right? Jack says, "Ask good questions." Well, that's one way. If you ask proper questions, you get on a certain type of board. If you ask aggressive questions, you get on a different type of board, right? So the newcomers are probably asking themselves, Jack says, Nam, Scott, Catherine should start looking at boards. Michael, do you have more advice for us about the balance between trust and experience? You have to be trustworthy because most of the time boards don't really want a troublemaker. That's why they're often weak. That's why they often just rubber stamp. Michael.
Yeah, so, okay, Bruce, this is a good question. One observation is, in my experience, having been on nonprofit boards and for-profit boards and public company board, in one case today, the big difference above all is that some boards are strategic boards and some are governance boards. So if you take a typical nonprofit has a strategic board. It discusses what's the mission, how are we addressing that mission, where are we going, how do we staff that, and how do we raise the money for that? That's a strategic board. A typical big company, Fortune 500, is a governance board. The company has a strategic planning department to deal with strategy and where the company is going, and it briefs the board of directors once a year, typically in January, about what's the corporate strategic plan. Okay, it's not a requirement of the board itself. The board is so overloaded with governance and compliance issues, whether it's finance and audit or whether it's compliance or whatever. So those big boards tend to be what I call governance boards. And the board that I'm on, it's a little bit of both because it's a medium-sized growth company. So it's a bit of both. So that's one thing is it a strategic board or a governance board?
I find that
another thing on
incredible.
trust.
Maybe others too. Go ahead, Mike.
CEOs, another aspect that I've seen is kind of a truth of the matter, even if we don't like it, is that CEOs only trust people who have been a CEO. They don't trust people, or they don't have complete trust in people that have never sat in their seat, have never lived in their shoes, don't know what is the buck stops here. I've just found that is just a truism. And so the best way to get on a board of a publicly traded company is to have been a CEO. And I know people will argue that. I'm just saying that's my experience, that trust factor from a CEO to other people is, have you been a CEO? Do you know what life I'm living? And that's very important. And if somebody doesn't have that, you can still be on a board, but just understand the relationship to the CEO might not be 100%.